thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much for the change to accommodate my schedule today. I'm actually in DC, so I have some on-the-ground work that I am doing today here in terms of U.S. policy. I am the Chief Legal Officer and a Senior Legal Advisor at Polygon Labs. Polygon Labs is an international software development company that builds blockchain scaling infrastructure. It's in 43 countries all over the globe, which means we engage in terms of policy issues really everywhere. So we engage in the EU, in the UK, Asia, as well as Africa, and of course, the United States. And this talk is really about, or entitled, Decoding Crypto Regulation. I think there's a high bar and a high expectation that there's a way to truly decode crypto policy, but I'm definitely going to give it a shot for you all today. I'm also, as the title of this notes, going to give a comparative view of regulation as between the US and the EU. I'll probably say some things that may surprise you today. And of course, I'll say many things that won't surprise you at all, just given where the EU sits and how out front MiCA really is in terms of crypto regulation across the globe. But first, let's think about how to think about a goal for crypto regulation. And I think as an industry, there is a goal for actually getting laws specific to this new technology and how it works in place. This comes in the form of wanting to ensure, I think that's the goal for the industry. I think the goal for regulators is very similar, because I think there is a generalized belief that without specific laws targeting crypto regulation, targeting crypto and blockchain, that you will not be able to achieve the regulatory goals of consumer protection, market integrity, and financial stability, and combating illicit finance. And so I will say, from a comparative law perspective, those goals are the same everywhere, regardless of jurisdiction. But what's the code for actually getting to the goal of crypto policy and getting to regulation? And I think there are a few pieces to this, and they cut across all jurisdictions, so the same everywhere. One is understanding the technology. I think from the advent of Bitcoin back in 2009, and when you read the Bitcoin white paper, there's a lot about the technology that feels different and new, and much of that is true. But I think we need to also think about blockchain as a product feature of the internet and make sure that we are breaking down this technology to not seem so far away and esoteric from the internet that we use today, but really a new enhanced feature that allows users of the internet to have sort of specialized ability to control their data, their information, their content, and their assets. I think then the second piece to decoding crypto regulation is understanding the laws. What laws apply where, but there are, I think, the regulatory goals that underlie all financial services laws and many consumer protection laws everywhere in the world are the same, which is protecting users and consumers and making sure people can interact both online and in the markets in a way that is predictable and stable. I think as a combination of those two, the third piece of getting towards the regulatory goal, or the third piece of this code, is understanding where the law and technology intersect, if at all. And really, I was a lawyer in this space before I took on a policy role full time, both when I was at the Ave companies and when I was in private practice at some law firms in the United States. And one of the things that we really had to take on in understanding how to advise clients was, what's the purpose underlying the law? If we don't have laws that we think specifically address this technology, either those who build it or those who use it, what are the policy goals underlying, let's say, securities laws or financial laws or consumer protection laws, and what actions can developers or users take to make sure that those policy goals are met if the law doesn't apply? So seeing where the law and the technology intersect is really, really important. The fourth piece to this code is education. And part of education that is extremely important is to stop using difficult terminology. I think it's something that, the best example I can give is we use staking about 5 or 6 different ways today to mean all sorts of different things. I think smart contracts and breaking down what that actually means from a policy perspective has become something that's even challenging to do. And so I think educating and breaking down really the technology so that there is this ability and understanding to see where the law and the technology can intersect is really important. I think the other piece of education that is really important is explaining why this technology is good, what benefits there are, and why we actually care about it, rather than it just being a piece of the internet that may die away or things that we don't need. And I think the last part that has become particularly important, and I would say this is much more important these days in the United States and other places, sort of winning hearts and minds on blockchain. What good and what positive social impact has been made as it comes to blockchain networks? And I think the reason it's really important to think about hearts and minds, and some of which I think people are just doing very recently in crypto policy, is because I think that it will motivate people to understand why good laws are important, why you want to keep technology in a certain place. But to sort of cap off where we are on the EU and the US front, I thought the way to go through it, since I've tried to break down the code to crypto policy into 5 pieces, would be to really talk about how each of those 5 pieces are really taking shape both in the US and the EU. So when we get to understanding the tech, I will say a little bit on it depends. So in the EU, there are definitely people in the European Commission, in Parliament, at the council level, and in various financial regulatory bodies in countries across the globe that deeply understand the technology. Some of them are in innovation divisions, and some of them are much more widespread. I will say MiCA also, and working on MiCA, working on complementary pieces of regulation to MiCA, in the EU means that more people are probably more intimately involved. And I think the fact that MiCA has really been going on, putting it together has been a multi-year process, has given people a reason to care and think about crypto, blockchain, and what it actually means and where it will actually make an impact in the European economy. So I'd say on understanding the tech, Europe is very, very far ahead, or the EU and EU regulators are very far ahead. So in the US, it really is it depends, because I think that over 2022, as institutions really started looking at blockchains and crypto, and as really policy efforts ramped up in Washington, D.C., which, as I said, is where I sit today, there have been certain policymakers who really have taken a great interest in it. Last Friday, Chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick McHenry, introduced a discussion draft for a brand new bill that is a market structure bill that tackles all sorts of different aspects of the crypto industry. In particular, it looks at centralized intermediaries, very much as MiCA does, and it also looks at token issuances, again, like MiCA does, but also tries to address certain different nuanced pieces of the industry that, in terms of any legislation or potential draft legislation that's been introduced in the United States, is very different. So they address something called end user distribution, which is really referring to something like airdrops. And I will say that is pretty novel in terms of how we have been thinking about legislation in the United States. And the other piece that Chair McHenry's legislation takes on is the question of decentralization. There's a definition, there's a test, because in the United States, there really are 2 regulatory buckets that something like crypto assets can fit into, whereas in MiCA and in other places in Europe, there's a real understanding of the different functional tests of what tokens do and how they work, and they don't necessarily have the same restrictive buckets. So on understanding the tech in terms of decoding US and EU, I would say the EU generally probably wins in that category, just because there has been such a sustained period of time with MiCA where regulators and policymakers have been looking at the tech to understand what the legislation means. I will say it's not perfect, and I think there's new legislation coming down that may touch on this technology where people have not spent as much time thinking about the long-term effects. But I will say the level of engagement, even from people in the EU, from people who have not yet even really dealt with the technology, is very, very high. There's a receptiveness on technology and discussing potential legislation that's very important, and I think very significant in the EU. In terms of understanding the laws, we'll let the US and the EU both sort of take an equal stance there. Regulators are really digging deep and really trying to understand, where the laws work in this industry. And that comes to the third prong here, which is understanding where the law and the technology intersect, if at all. I think we can see even across the EU, various jurisdictions are really trying to understand where the law and the tech intersect. So something like the ACPR's recent DeFi paper that was a discussion draft and looked for a call for evidence and and also was to have responses from the public, really, really looked deeply at where the law and the technology intersect. Do we want permissionless blockchain networks, only permissioned networks? What do we do about certain policy goals in terms of who makes sure there is security? Is it the users? Is it the builders? Is it, and so I think really the consultation process and the industry engagement process that you see in the EU is extremely robust. It's been being built out for a number of years, both through MiCA and then through European countries, really understanding there is great promise for this technology and going from there. On education, I think that the EU probably wins out over there as well, just because there's been a longer, as I said, sustained period of time with respect to MiCA. And then the last thing on hearts and minds, I will say the EU is very far out ahead, because I think that they understand and have seen what technology has done in other places. And it may do one thing that's very important on hearts and minds, and that we are actually working on, is that understanding the value proposition of blockchain is extremely important. There's been an extraordinary amount of focus, both in the EU and in the US, on financial regulation and how these crypto assets or other types of financial activity that may occur on blockchains should be regulated. That's important, but that is sort of the starting point from where we are with blockchains. As of today, blockchain infrastructure touches all different parts of the economy. And what I will say is extremely important is that DG Grow has really been thinking about this in a significant way, and including very recently, to think about where blockchain technology, the metaverse, crypto, supply chains, really can make an impact in the EU economy. And I will say that it's something that US regulators are just thinking about today. There is a hearing in the Innovation Subcommittee of the Energy and Commerce Committee today about building blockchains. And it is the first hearing on anything like this. And it's really looking on non-financial use cases of blockchain. So whereas there is this hearts and minds and education piece that is really been far ahead and built out in the EU based on some great work by the Commission, that work is really starting right now in the US in earnest from a policy perspective. What I will say, though, is, yes, I gave grades on each of the 5 different pieces of the code of breaking down crypto policy. And obviously the EU, given the work that really went into MiCA, which was significant and thoughtful and detailed, makes the EU maybe come out on top. I don't know if I think there are as vast of differences when you get down to the engagement level. There are some policymakers and regulators who understand the technology, understand the promise, understand the intersection between the technology and law, and there are not. But what I think is very, very different between the EU and the US is something that does touch on policy and affects it. And it goes to this last prong that I talked about, winning hearts and minds, but it is the PR problem that crypto has had. I think it was the same for a number of years as between the US and the EU, where there were questions about illicit finance, and large financial institutions were very much pushing that crypto was only used by criminals or didn't have positive uses or had a negative impact on users and things like that. But I think given the events of 2022 and how deeply involved US persons were in many of the either frauds or extraordinary implosions of certain crypto companies, there is a deeper PR problem in the US with respect to crypto than there is in the EU, because I think there has been this understanding for a long time of what blockchain is really good for. So I hope I helped to decode a little bit today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and I wish you a great rest of your conference.